The rain had just stopped when Sarah Jefferson stepped off the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, her worn leather shoes sinking into the muddy pavement. The year was 1963, and though the storm had passed, the air was thick with the tension of another kind of quiet, heavy pressure that came from generations of being told to stay in one's place. Sarah looked up at the church on the corner, where the lights inside glowed like embers in the night. She adjusted her coat, gripped her notebook tighter, and walked toward it. Inside, the church hummed with murmurs and restless energy. People filled the wooden pews, men in worn suits, women clutching Bibles, children sitting wide-eyed beside them. At the front stood Reverend Cole, a tall man with a booming voice that could shake walls and soothe hearts all at once. "My brothers and sisters," he said, "freedom doesn't come wrapped in ribbons. It comes with struggle, with sacrifice, with courage." Sarah took a seat in the back, opening her notebook. She was a young journalist from the Southern Tribune, one of the few black reporters working for a paper that dared to print stories about the growing civil rights movement. Her editor had told her to capture the truth, no matter how dangerous. She had been capturing it ever since the marches, the arrests, the quiet defiance that filled every street corner. But tonight, she was not here to report. She was here to remember. As the Reverend spoke, Sarah's mind drifted to the voice that had first awakened her, the voice of her father, Thomas Jefferson, a humble carpenter who had marched for justice long before it was safe to do so. He used to say, "A man's worth ain't in what he owns, but in what he stands for." He had stood tall even when they came for him. It was 1955 when her father was arrested for joining a bus boycott after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Sarah was 12, and she remembered watching through the kitchen window as the police dragged him away. Her mother had wept quietly, her tears falling into the pot of beans on the stove. When he returned months later, his hands were rougher, his eyes heavier, but he still smiled and said, "Freedom's a long road, baby girl, but we'll walk it together." Now, years later, Sarah was walking it alone, but his voice still echoed inside her. The church erupted into song, "We Shall Overcome." The melody rose like smoke, filling every corner with hope that refused to die. Sarah joined in, her voice trembling but strong. After the service, she stepped outside and found herself face to face with the man she had seen on posters and heard on radios across the South, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He smiled warmly. "You're the young reporter from the Tribune, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," she said, her heart pounding. "I'm trying to document what's happening. The world needs to know, and you will help them know," he said, "because truth has a way of speaking louder than any mob." Those words would follow her for years. That night, Sarah wrote until dawn. She described the hymns, the faces, the fire in the people's eyes. She wrote about the ordinary men and women who became heroes simply by refusing to be silent. And when her article was published, letters poured into the paper, some praising her courage, others threatening her life. But Sarah didn't stop. When the March on Washington was announced, she knew she had to go. She packed her notebook, a camera, and a small photograph of her father. The bus ride north took nearly 2 days, filled with activists singing freedom songs and praying for strength. On August 28, 1963, she stood among hundreds of thousands at the Lincoln Memorial. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. And then, a hush fell over the crowd as Dr. King approached the podium. "I have a dream, a broken bar." The words rippled through the crowd like a wave, washing over Sarah until her eyes blurred with tears. She wasn't just hearing a speech, she was witnessing history breathe. Every syllable carried the weight of centuries, the pain of slavery, the scars of segregation, and the unbreakable belief that tomorrow could be better. When the crowd erupted into applause, Sarah lifted her camera and captured the moment of the faces of strangers joined by one dream. That photograph would later appear on the front page of newspapers across the nation. It became one of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement, a sea of humanity united under the shadow of Lincoln's statue. eyes lifted toward hope. But freedom was never won in a single speech. A few months later, Sarah was sent to Birmingham, where children marched in the streets, singing for justice even as fire hoses knocked them down. The air smelled of tear gas and smoke. Policemen shouted, dogs barked, and still, the children sang. Sarah ran beside them, notebook clutched to her chest, heartbreaking as she watched a young boy fall, crying but unbroken. She knelt beside him. "Why are you out here, baby?" she asked gently. He wiped his tears and said, "Because my mama says if we don't march, nobody will." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She wrote about that boy, about his courage, about how freedom had a small, defiant face covered in dust and tears. Her story ran nationwide, and soon, the world could no longer look away. But the more she wrote, the more the danger grew. In 1964, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Sarah traveled to Mississippi to cover voter registration efforts. The roads were long and lonely, lined with fields that whispered secrets of the past. She stayed with local families who risked everything to teach their neighbors how to sign their names and claim their rights. One evening, as she left a small community center, a car followed her. She quickened her pace, clutching her bag. The headlights glared brighter, closer. Then, a voice shouted, "Go back where you came from." A bottle shattered near her feet. She ran into the woods, her heart pounding, her breath ragged. When she finally reached safety hours later, she realized something had changed inside her. She was no longer just a reporter. She was part of the fight. That night, she wrote, "Freedom isn't just a headline. It's the sound of a mother singing to her child in the dark, promising a better tomorrow. It's the echo of feet marching on dusty roads. It's the voice that refuses to be silenced." Those words were reprinted across America. They inspired protests, donations, and movements in towns she'd never seen. People began calling her the voice of freedom. But to Sarah, she was just her father's daughter, doing what he taught her to stand. In 1965, she stood once more, this time in Selma, where thousands gathered to march for voting rights. The bridge loomed at Edmund Pettus Bridge, its steel arch glinting under pale sky. She saw young John Lewis at the front, his face calm but resolute. The marchers moved forward, singing "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." Then came the troopers, helmets gleaming, clubs raised. Sarah's camera shook as she took pictures of the first swing, the screams, the chaos. She was knocked to the ground, her notebook flying from her hands. Through the dust and the pain, she saw the marchers refuse to fight back. They knelt and prayed as they were beaten. That night, bleeding and shaken, she wrote by candlelight, "Today, I saw courage. I saw love stronger than hate. I saw people who would rather die standing than live on their knees." Her story made front-page news again. Days later, the nation watched as President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. Years passed, the marches slowed, laws changed, but prejudice didn't vanish, it simply learned to hide its face. Sarah kept writing, documenting every victory, every setback. By the time she turned 40, her hair was streaked with gray, her voice softer but steadier. She had interviewed presidents and mothers who lost their sons to hate. She had walked through burned churches, sat in courtrooms where justice trembled on the edge of a verdict, and stood in classrooms filled with children who could finally dream without fear. One spring morning in 1970, Sarah visited her hometown. The streets looked smaller, quieter. She walked to the old church where she had once sat in the back pew. The doors creaked open, and inside she found a handful of children rehearsing a school play about the movement. Their teacher recognized her instantly. "Miss Jefferson, you're the voice of freedom." Sarah laughed softly. "I'm just a writer, child." The teacher smiled. "You're more than that. You helped tell our story." Sarah watched as a little girl stepped forward to recite a speech, Dr. King's words, delivered with innocent pride. "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. That night, she sat by her window, looking at the stars, and wrote one final entry in her journal: "Freedom isn't something given, it's something claimed, fought for, lived every day. It's the song of a people who refuse to be silent. It's the whisper of my father, the cry of the children, the dream of a nation still becoming. I have walked the road of freedom, and though it is long, I have never walked alone." She closed the journal, smiling through her tears. Outside, the world was changing still as slowly, unevenly, but moving forward. Years later, when Sarah Jefferson passed away, people gathered in that same church to honor her. On the pulpit rested her camera and her notebook, worn and filled with the stories of a generation. Reverend Cole, now old and gray, stood before the crowd. "She gave voice to the voiceless," he said, "and though she is gone, her words still march on." The choir began to sing "We Shall Overcome," and somewhere, in the echo of that song, in the rustle of freedom's long road, the voice of Sarah Jefferson lived on, the voice of freedom, forever telling the story of those who dared to believe that all men and women are created equal. The rain began again, soft and gentle, washing the streets of Montgomery clean. And through the mist, it seemed the whole city whispered her name, and not as a reporter, not as a martyr, but as what she had always been, the heart of a people's dream. Because freedom has many voices, and hers would never fade.